Oda already foreshadowed the ending of the Egghead arc with very subtle hints, and let me just say this arc is ending with a literal bang. Dragon will be making his exciting entrance, and Blackbeard will finally make a game-changing move which will force the world government to crown him a pirate king under the world government. But first we have to start with our main focus of this video, which will lead us into the rest of the chaos that will ensue because of the Egghead incident, and that is Bartholomew Kuma. See, I believe Kuma will sacrifice himself to save Bonnie and the Straw Hats using his self-destruction feature that Gorosei Saturn introduced in chapter 1102. But before we jump into everything, subscribe if you're not already, and make sure to hit that bell like Luffy and Skypiea for more future One Piece videos just like this. First, to understand why I believe that Kuma will sacrifice himself using the self-destruction feature, I have to explain first how Oda already dropped two major clues that prove this. The first clue is revealed in chapter 1102 when we find out that Saturn has asked Vegapunk to implement a self-destruct feature into Kuma, and that really got my mind racing because I realized that Kuma will showcase this power at the end of Egghead to save Bonnie and Luffy, using it to help defeat Gorosei Saturn. Oda wouldn't just simply introduce something this major at the end of Kuma's backstory just for it to not be this important in this arc. And the cool thing about all of this is that Kuma using the self-destruction feature against Saturn is such a cool twist of irony by Oda, because Saturn was the one who forced Vegapunk to implement it into Kuma in the first place, meaning the very sinister feature will be what brings Saturn's own downfall in the end. And the second clue is that Oda ties in Kuma going rogue to this self-destruction feature, as they're both brought up hand in hand together by Saturn when he says that if Kuma was to go rogue, how would anyone stop him? Foreshadowing that the self-destruction feature would be used if Kuma did go rogue, which we already did see, so this foreshadows that at some point in Egghead we will see the self-destruction feature brought up again. In chapter 1067 we first saw Kuma acting strange as Limburg of the Revolutionaries was repairing him. This is where we first saw Kuma begin to malfunction, so it makes me wonder if Lindbergh, who is a scientist, did something by accident or maybe even intentionally which caused Kuma to go rogue. Then in the middle of chapters 1068 we saw Kuma Pawpaw blasting away from the revolutionaries into the sky. In chapter 1071 we finally see Kuma charge and fly straight into the red line of Marijua, and then finally in chapter 1086 we see Kuma fighting a Kainu and using his devil fruit to disappear and escape. So the question is if Kuma is malfunctioning or fully rogue, and was he programmed to return to Egghead at some point if he ever did go rogue, or is it possible that Kuma is fully conscious, or is it really how Ivankov stated, is he purely running off of instinct? I believe that Kuma has gone mindlessly rogue, but his programming has him glitched out into a specific mission or protocol that Vegapunk may have implanted into him to return to Egghead. Like we could be witnessing the multiple personality programming that Vegapunk was telling Saturn that he was planning on implementing in the first place. And you might say it's a reach, but let's get even crazier, because maybe Limburg was the one who activated this when he was trying to bring back Kuma. Because at the end of the day, Dragon was on good terms with Vegapunk, who created Kuma, and maybe Limburg is some kind of apprentice who once worked with Vegapunk but then ended up switching over to the revolutionaries. Kind of like the opposite to Kuma. But basically what I'm saying is that with Kuma's arrival with Luffy down, I believe this is where we'll see Vegapunk and Kuma get a chance to shine. As Crow from our OPU podcast put it, this is Vegapunk's chance to show that he can outsmart Saturn. And Saturn warned him in chapter 1102 that he would detect if Vegapunk attempts to deceive or fool him because he's also a man of science. So maybe, as I mentioned, Vegapunk did figure out a way to hide Kuma's activation to betray the world government, even if he wasn't able to fully give him free will or his memories. Maybe Vegapunk also programmed Kuma to protect Bonnie at all costs. And with Vegapunk holding on to Kuma's memories, it makes you wonder if he'll have some kind of trick up his sleeve that allows Kuma to fuse his old memories back into his current body, which could bring him back to reality. It would be really cool for Vegapunk to showcase in real time and prove to us why he's deserving of his reputation once again as the smartest scientist in the world, especially in such a clutch and important moment like this. But then again, we did see Vegapunk crying, and a lot of crying, so this might imply that Vegapunk wasn't able to figure out a way to deceive Saturn. But you guys let me know in the comments, do you think Vegapunk still has a trick up his sleeve, and do you think he's the key to bringing back Kuma? Now let's say Vegapunk isn't the answer to bringing back Kuma's free will. This leads me to another idea for how I think Kuma's consciousness and personality could return. I believe we will continue to see Kuma fighting Saturn as he's rogue, but eventually Saturn may be able to gain control over Kuma's mind as he's the highest authority. So I believe it could actually be Luffy, not Vegapunk, who frees Kuma's mind and soul, bringing him back to normal. We are currently seeing Luffy eating food, and we all know what that means. Luffy is going to return to the fight eventually. You see, we still don't have any kind of idea what the connection of the giant ancient robot will have to the plot of the Egghead Island arc, but many of us have speculated that this robot had began to awaken because of Luffy's Gear 5 drums of liberation, which activated the robot from hibernation. And what's cool is that we saw the ancient robot awaken in the exact same chapter that Kuma teleported away and fought against Akainu at Marizua. And what's interesting is that Sakazuki blasted his leg off with magma and blasted a portion of his face off, similar to how he did to Whitebeard before his death at Marineford. So maybe that's another hint that Kuma will have a huge and impactful death similar to Whitebeard that will change the world. But going back to the ancient robot and Kuma, since we know that Vegapunk was inspired by the technology of the ancient kingdom for his own creations of Egghead Island, is it really a stretch to say that Kuma's transformation into a mindless robotic cyborg man was inspired and only possible due to Vegapunk's research on this giant robot? I mean, we already saw something similar to this in the Vega Force 1, so maybe all the pacifistas and Seraphim, or at least Kuma specifically, was all created as a direct inspiration from the ancient kingdom's technology. And I think now you can see where I'm heading with this. Gear 5 Luffy's heartbeat may also be the key to bringing back Kuma to his consciousness while in the presence of Nika, since Oda has already hinted that Kuma has ties to this ancient robot. Like for example, Rogue Kuma charged headfirst into the red line and attacked Marizua just like the giant robot did 200 years ago. So is this really just instinct as it was speculated by Ivankov? Once again, it makes me think there could be some kind of programming attached to this, because after Marizua, Kuma's very next arrival would be Egghead, and this was where Kuma was created and will eventually die. But I guess if this is true, if Luffy can awaken Kuma, and he did awaken the ancient robot, that makes me wonder who awakened the ancient robots all those years ago when it attacked the red line similar to Kuma. I mean, according to the Gorosei, the Nika fruit hadn't been awakened in centuries, and I think most of us assumed that no one had awakened the Nika fruit except for Luffy or the original Joy Boy. But maybe there was someone 200 years ago that was erased from history who did. I mean, 200 years ago is still centuries ago. Or maybe there's just multiple ways to activate these ancient robots. But let me know if you have any ideas on this in the comments, and if I see anything that sparks a cool idea, I'll make a separate video on this in the future. Another idea I had when chapter 1086 originally dropped was that maybe Kuma was the one that activated the robots. But now that I'm thinking about it, maybe Luffy triggering the robot to awaken is actually what made Kuma travel to Egghead. The ancient robot may have been tied to Kuma's biology and programming, which in turn is the instinct that Ivankov speaks of because they're made so similarly. And since the awakened robot is at Egghead, its first initial thought was to go to Marizua and then go to find the robots. And so that's why Kuma teleported away from the fight with Akainu simultaneously as the robot awakened in the very same chapter. It may really just be as simple as what Vegapunk says, that fate is a strange thing. And some people may not like to hear this, but Kuma is fated to die and arrive at Egghead. He is fated to be a pillar of this incident. As I mentioned earlier, I think Saturn will at some point finally gain control over Kuma, and this brings me to a horrible scenario. Because someone in our chat during our OPU stream said, what if Saturn orders Kuma to take out Bonnie? And it was such an evil idea that I kind of love, because it really feels like something that could happen, especially with how evil, twisted, and heartless Saturn has been presented so far. It would be really emotional for Bonnie to finally meet Kuma after all these years. He saves her, but the next thing you know, he's about to attack her. Or instead of Bonnie, Kuma could also be ordered to take out his friend Vegapunk. But whether it's Vegapunk or Bonnie, this could actually be really hype, because what if this is the clutch moment that Kuma's about to attack Vegapunk under these orders, and then Luffy finally gets back up at the last second to save them? And this would also be a beautiful ending to Kuma's story, because he finally gets to witness Nika with Luffy going Gear 5. After placing all this hope in Luffy and believing that he was Nika, believing that he was Joy Boy to save the entire world. But more importantly, this would be Luffy giving Kuma the freedom to choose how he dies, as Kuma's now able to finally make a decision to fight alongside Joy Boy against Saturn and to help his daughter, a conscious, true decision. And doing this, he could help everyone escape by sacrificing himself. Kuma's entire character is all about sacrifice, so that's why I really do think his final moments will be, of course, a sacrifice. Now this leads us into some other cool ideas I had after Luffy frees Kuma's mind. For example, now we would see Bonnie, Kuma, and Luffy fighting side by side against Saturn for a single chapter, similar to Ace and Luffy in Marineford. For Bonnie and Kuma, it would be a great father-daughter moment, and so rewarding after knowing everything that Saturn's done to both Kuma and Bonnie, and also a great moment since they both look up to Nika. The cool thing about Bonnie and Luffy fighting together is that what if Bonnie could mimic Gear 5 and fight in a Gear 5-ish timeline? We've already seen her pull out multiple Gear 3 Nika punches, but witnessing Nika for the very first time should make her much stronger and much more inspired. And even Saturn explains that if she truly believed in Nika, this would make her more powerful. So Gear 5 Luffy may be the key to unlocking Bonnie's true power in Egghead, not only from the stance of her belief increasing her abilities' power, but also from the idea that she'll become much more creative. Seeing Luffy use many childish and fun techniques would also inspire Bonnie as well. And then maybe we could also see Kuma using something like Todo's Boogie Woogie from Jujutsu Kaisen, shooting Bonnie or Luffy behind Saturn at blitzing speeds to land some critical Gear 5 style attacks. Another possibility is that maybe Kuma can heal Luffy and Bonnie's pain from their fights, restoring them back to full health. And don't even get me started on the possibility that Bonnie could potentially temporarily transform Luffy into his physical prime by aging him up to fight Saturn, which would honestly be one of the craziest chapters in One Piece. I'd prefer her to use this on someone old like GARP, which we made a video on before, where she could revert GARP into his younger prime. But we can't rule out the possibility of her doing it with Luffy and Egghead. We've seen just how hype and terrifying something like this has been before in something like Hunter x Hunter, so I would be really excited to see a One Piece version of this, since Bonnie's power should be able to do something similar if she can transform people into old versions and babies. But when using these abilities on someone as powerful as Luffy, I'd assume this would take a lot of energy, maybe even all of her energy, and so maybe that's a reason why she wouldn't want to use something like this all the time. But maybe this would be a broken ability, but it could also allow Luffy to temporarily bypass his huge Gear 5 stamina issues. Or maybe instead of something as broken as Prime Luffy, she could transform him into a stamina form, which would give Luffy a lot more stamina in Gear 5, which is definitely possible because we've also seen Bonnie go into a physically stronger mode like in the buff Bonnie timeline form. I also just realized that Kuma fighting the other pacifistas would also be a cool moment as well. Maybe he'll fight against S-Bear or many of the other pacifistas in general. Now we have to talk about the tragedy that's going to be Kuma's sacrifice. We've already seen Kuma help Luffy escape back in the Sabaody arc, so Kuma sacrificing himself again is very likely and very in character, as we've seen him throughout his flashback to be a man who embodies sacrificing himself for others. He'll do whatever it takes to help Nika and save Bonnie, the two things that he cares about the most. I mean, the guy even sold his soul to the devil to make sure Bonnie would be safe and healthy. But in the current events at Egghead Island, there's even more on the line now. Kuma's already made us cry many times, and I hate to be that guy, but this is not going to end well for Kuma, especially right after Oda gave us that entire flashback. And you know that flashbacks in One Piece are often correlated to tragedy and emotional moments, and Oda's pulled no punches so far with the tragedy of Kuma. Kuma truly does deserve a happy ending, which is also what makes this theory so sad, as we'll be witnessing his final moments in the current timeline. Unlike someone like Odin, it will be a death more like Whitebeard's. So after Luffy, Kuma, and Bonnie fight together for a few fun chapters like Ace and Luffy did in Marineford, we'll eventually see that Saturn is a very dangerous and overpowered character that must be stopped at all costs. The Marines have an entire fleet, multiple vice admirals, Pacifista, and Seraphim running wild. And this is where Kuma would tell Vegapunk that he wants to use the self-destruction feature and sacrifice himself against Gorosei's Saturn. I think this could play out in one of two ways. The first way being that Kuma's sacrificial attack is enough to stun Saturn for a brief moment, allowing for Gear 5 Luffy to land a major finishing blow. Either way, I think it's important to have Luffy and Kuma both involved in the final battle versus Saturn, as it would be such a cool thing to witness for Kuma, as Nika has been his idol since he was a child. But another way this could play out is that Kuma is the finishing blow against Saturn after an awakening, and after he's already teleported Bonnie and the Straw Hats away to a distant island using the Pawpaws launching technique, getting everyone out of danger and finishing off the battle himself. This final sacrifice will finish off Saturn, Kuma taking him down Majin Vegeta style. I also wonder if this entire explosion could destroy the laboratory that the government is trying to seize. Now in chapter 1078, we see a narration box that reads, "This has been the records of the events before the day of the famous Egghead incident." And what I'm about to tell you might solidify this theory, because what if I told you that Oda already dropped the most mind-blowing clue? You see, in the same panels that contain this text box foreshadowing that the Egghead incident will be this game-changing moment, we see Oda draw a very familiar symbol. That's right, it's none other than Kuma's paw. Almost as if Oda's trying to tell us, not only foreshadowing that Kuma would come to Egghead, but once again Kuma's sacrifice itself is the major moment of the Egghead incident. But now that we know about Kuma's sacrifice, how does this all affect the One Piece world? Since Egghead is such a hyped up and major moment, we also have to explore the other possibilities and other big moments that could come alongside Kuma's sacrifice. And I want to start by asking who survives and who doesn't survive. So yes, sadly Kuma doesn't survive, but what about Gorosei's Saturn, or Vegapunk, or what about Kizaru? Now I know some people might be upset of the idea of a Gorosei dying just after being introduced, but I think it's very possible, which will also be important because it could give us more hints to the Gorosei and their powers, and how you could become become a Gorosei in the first place. It's possible this would be the first moment a Gorosei is defeated and killed in centuries, and this would completely shake the world, and it would also lead to another theory that Oars is currently working on that explains why we believe that Figureland could be the next replacement Gorosei if Saturn does indeed die. The Gorosei are very secretive, and they are trying to keep as much information about them unknown, Saturn even attacking his own marine soldiers who've seen his powers. And this makes me think they don't want anyone to know their powers so that people in the world can't learn the weaknesses and have an element of surprise whenever they're activating their transformations. I also think if the Gorosei are revealed to the world, this would make Shanks all the more important, because now at some point in Elbaf, I would love to see Shanks and Straw Hat discussion about the Gorosei, with Shanks having inside information on them and revealing to the crew that there's actually 5 of these monsters running around the world government from the shadows. And while Luffy may not care about the details aside from the simplicity that he now needs to defeat a few more of these guys, to someone like Nico Robin whose home was destroyed thanks to the Gorosei, it would be a huge moment to learn about their existence and their power. Now what about Vegapunk? Personally, I always believed that Lilith would survive while the main Vegapunk would die at Egghead. But this brings up an important question, because what happens to the other satellites if the main body of Vegapunk ceases to exist? I can also see a scenario where Vegapunk survives and Luffy managed to escape him. And so while I do think that Vegapunk could die, giving a huge announcement that will shake the world similar to Whitebeard declaring the One Piece is real, Vegapunk could announce something about Nika, the ancient kingdom, or about how the world government was formed. Early in the arc, Vegapunk predicts his own downfall, but Luffy being the sun god Nika to pull out another miracle, it could be possible that he saves him, and it would be a really cool moment because Kuma believed in him, and this would be proof for Vegapunk finally that Luffy is as great as Kuma says. And I think we can also expect that Kuma will Pawpaw blast the Straw Hats to Elbaf, which is something that we've been waiting for since Little Garden. Elbaf isn't too far away from Egghead Island, and we've had a lot of foreshadowing that it will be the next arc, with Luffy and Usopp singing and joking about it, and Shanks also being revealed to have conquered Elbaf as his Yonko territory. But what's important is that Kuma's sacrifice will only infuriate Monkey D. Dragon and piss him off, lighting up his passion for the war against the Celestial Dragons even more. The entire revolutionary army will be enraged, and it will inspire them more than ever. I also think the most important aspect of the Egghead incident is after this moment where Luffy is now directly at war with the world government. He's aided to take down a Gorosei, he's defeated an admiral, he's either kidnapped or maybe framed responsible for the downfall of Vegapunk and the destruction of Egghead Island, and he's potentially now going to be allied with the revolutionary army as they find a common enemy. I just don't see any way this doesn't jumpstart the preparations for the final arc, especially since Luffy already shown that he wants to invade Marizua, and he doesn't even know yet what happened with Vivi, which is an entirely additional reason for Luffy to be in a direct war with the world government. Also, where does this leave Bonnie? Now that she knows really what happened to Kuma, and now that Kuma's gone, does she become a Straw Hat pirate? Does she reunite with her crew? Does she kind of just disappear? I mean, personally for me, I believe that Kuma's sacrifice will inspire Bonnie to become a revolutionary. We already know that she's been keeping tabs on them, and Sabo and Kuma had proven the revolutionaries are actually a good and necessary cause. It just seems like the perfect fit for her, with Dragon welcoming her in. Both Ginny and Kuma were former revolutionaries, and she'd be very welcomed by the people who knew them in the past. Plus, it could tie in the theme of inherited will, with Bonnie carrying on Kuma's legacy. Kuma gave up his role in Dragon's revolution because he wanted to focus on Bonnie's safety and health. He made that sacrifice knowing fully what was most important to him, but it didn't mean that he didn't care about the revolution and his crew, as we saw that he would still occasionally help them from time to time. And speaking of the revolutionaries, let's talk about the elephant in the room. Will Oda pull the trigger on Dragon arriving at Egghead? I've said it before and I'll say it again, there's not a single better opportunity than to have Luffy and Dragon meet at the Egghead Island. Just like Kuma is the centerpiece here, tied to Bonnie, Vegapunk, the Straw Hats, Saturn, and Kizaru, Dragon is tied to Vegapunk, Luffy, Kuma, and the world government as well. And just like Bonnie finally met Kuma here, it would be really cool if Dragon also meets Luffy as well. I think if Dragon really is a Winlogia or has some kind of mythical fruit, he should be able to arrive in time. And the revolutionaries are already trying to actively figure out where Kuma has gone, hinting at the fact that if Dragon does figure out that Kuma's at Egghead, he might go after him and meet him there. It's funny how many fans theorized that Dragon would show up at Marineford to save Luffy and Ace, but Shanks ended up having the hype entrance, so this would be Dragon's actual big entrance similar to Shanks stopping the war. Now, what about the most mysterious and maybe the most chaotic character? What about Blackbeard? We know Blackbeard pirate ships are at Egghead, so what's their surprising role here? Will they get a hold of powerful devil fruits like Kuma and Saturn's, or maybe they're trying to get their hands on the Pacifista and the Seraphim, since we know that Blackbeard ran into S-Hawk at Amazon Lily, or maybe he's seeking information on the Mother Flame. But while all of these are really cool ideas, I have my own theory. Because what if Saturn survives even though he's defeated? And Blackbeard's role here is kidnapping Saturn and holding him for ransom. You see, I like the idea that maybe Morgan paints a parallel between Luffy kidnapping Vegapunk and then Blackbeard kidnapping the Gorosei. We already know he has GARP, and we know Blackbeard wanted to use Kobe as a bargaining chip to make his dream of a pirate kingdom become a reality. So if he now has GARP and Saturn, Blackbeard has so much leverage on the world government. Because GARP is the most influential marine ever, and now he has one of the 5 Gorosei. We've seen Blackbeard take advantage of everyone's dirty work before when he took Whitebeard's devil fruit in Marineford. So why would we expect anything different from the Blackbeard pirates in this arc? Especially since we already know some of them are in the island. And this would also make sense that Blackbeard knows about the Egghead incident because he has Kuzan in his crew who has so much inside information on the Marines through many shady connections. Like for example when Smoker called him out at Punk Hazard saying, "How did you know I was here?" Proving that Kuzan has information on the Marines and pirates that is very beneficial to Blackbeard planning out something huge at Egghead. But I think maybe the most underrated character in the entire Egghead incident is Morgans. I believe Morgans will also be a huge key to expose many of the major pieces that will happen during the Egghead incident. He's currently making an enemy of the world government, and we've seen him even gas up Luffy multiple times. If you remember Buggy in Marineford, he exposed everything to the world by live streaming the Marineford incident for the world to see. Instead of Buggy here, I think Morgans will play this role. In chapter 1074, we see Morgan say, "Look at that, an incredible scoop has landed in my lap," after he turns off a transponder snail, implying that someone is leaking him information about the Egghead incident. But who is the unknown source? Personally, I believe the unknown source is Stussy, because we've seen they have connections working together during the Whole Cake Island arc at Big Mom's wedding. So Stussy, who is now an ally with Vegapunk and has now also made an enemy of Cypher Poe just like Morgan's, I think it's very likely that she's the one leaking him the information on what's happening just to get the story out to the world. And if we know how he is already going to frame Luffy's actions, we can only imagine how he may spice up Blackbeard's, the world governments, and anyone else involved. This makes Morgans one of the most important characters because he can directly shift and shape the world, pushing agendas and narratives through his exciting, embellished reporting. If you enjoyed this video or anything I've said, make sure to leave a like and share this video to support us. And if you want to watch a video on my favorite One Piece theory ever, click right here where I reveal Oda's secret favorite anime, which helped me solve the One Piece.